You already know Prometheus. Every viewer from Athens to Auckland knows Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, who was chained to a rock in the Caucasus for eternity, his liver torn out each day by an eagle, regrowing each night so the torture could begin again. You know that story. You carry it. You know Azazel if you've been with this series, the watcher who descended on Mount Hermon with 199 of his kind and taught humanity weapons, metalwork, and the forbidden arts of ornamentation, who was bound hand and foot, cast into the darkness of the desert of Dudael, buried under rough, jagged rocks with his face covered so he cannot see the light, waiting there for the final fire of judgment. You know that story too. Most viewers do not know Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, the freshwater deep, the arts of civilization, closely associated with the Apkallu, the 7 divine sages, whose teachings to humanity encompassed writing, law, mathematics, and the foundations of civilized life before the flood, who protected humanity against the more punitive gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, whose knowledge transfers were celebrated rather than condemned, who was never punished for anything he gave. Here is the disruption. These are not 3 isolated stories. They are 3 versions of the same ancient problem. In each tradition, a divine or semi-divine being crosses the boundary between the gods and humanity to transfer knowledge that was not supposed to be shared. The divine order responds. The being is bound, punished, or exiled. Humanity is permanently changed by what it received. The structure is close enough across traditions separated by geography, language, and centuries that it demands comparison. The only thing that differs is the verdict. Whether the act was a gift or a crime, whether the being was a hero or a criminal, whether humanity was elevated or corrupted by what it received. These are not 3 isolated stories. They are 3 answers to the same ancient problem. What happens when knowledge crosses from the divine world into the human one? In the Mesopotamian answer, the transfer is sanctioned and civilization is born. In the Greek answer, the transfer is theft, but the thief becomes a hero. In the Enochic answer, the transfer is corruption, and the giver becomes the source of all sin. The structure is shared. The verdict is not. This video asks why the verdicts diverge so completely. By the end of this video, you will understand the precise structural parallel across all 3 traditions. Enki through the Apkallu, Prometheus in Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, Azazel in 1st Enoch 8-10, with specific textual citations from each. You will understand why the moral verdict differs so completely between them, what each tradition believed about the nature of knowledge, the proper relationship between divine and human spheres, and what humanity was before the transfer and what it became after. You will understand which material is oldest, where influence is plausible, and where the evidence points more toward shared cultural reservoirs than direct borrowing, and what those distinctions reveal about the specific argument the Enochic tradition was making. And you will understand what the 3 verdicts together force into view, a question none of the 3 traditions could fully answer. The question of whether human knowledge is a gift or a theft is not an ancient mythological curiosity. It underlies every tradition's account of human origins, and it has never been answered the same way twice. The Sumerian answer, we were given it by beings who wanted us to flourish. The Greek answer, we were given it by a being who suffered for the gift. The Enochic answer, we were given it by beings who transgressed in giving it. And the knowledge itself was the corruption, not merely the means of it. These three answers are still present in how the cultures that inherited them think about science, technology, civilization, and the proper limits of human ambition. The argument these three traditions were having is not over. It is just no longer recognized as the same argument. In the later Greek tradition, Prometheus is eventually freed. Heracles kills the eagle, breaks the chains, and Prometheus walks out of the Caucasus. The punishment ends. In the Enochic tradition, Azazel is never freed. He waits under his desert rocks until the final fire of judgment. The punishment does not end. It escalates into destruction. The same act, the same punishment structure, two completely different outcomes. Hold that. Enki is the Sumerian god of wisdom, the Abzu, the fresh water deep beneath the earth. The arts of craftsmanship, magic, and intelligence, and his relationship to humanity is the most benevolent knowledge transfer account in the ancient record. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly what Enki gave humanity, why the Mesopotamian tradition celebrated rather than condemned the transfer, and why Enki's near total absence from Western discussions of the knowledge giver archetype is itself a theological statement, one worth examining. To understand Enki's role, you first need to understand where he sits in the Mesopotamian divine order. He is one of the four primary creator gods alongside An, the sky, Enlil, the wind and authority, and Ninhursag, the earth and birth. An commands the celestial sphere. Enlil governs the fate of nations and deals with humanity with notable severity. Enki occupies the fresh water beneath the earth, the source of fertility and intelligence. In the Mesopotamian theological imagination, Enki is the god most consistently oriented toward human welfare. When the other gods deliberate about human fate, and their deliberations run toward punishment, Enki is typically the voice that intervenes. His specific relationship to the transmission of knowledge runs through the Apkallu, the seven divine sages closely associated with Enki and Ea in the Mesopotamian tradition, who carried the Me, the divine powers and decrees governing civilized existence. The Me are not a simple list of skills. They are the conceptual substrate of organized society. The powers, offices, arts, and institutions through which divine order is expressed in the human world. The Me encompass the descent of kingship, the institution of the priesthood, the arts of craft, music, and ritual, and the regulated social forms within which Sumerian civilization understood itself to be operating legitimately. To possess the Me was to be in right relationship with the divine order. To transmit them was to extend that right relationship outward. This is the theological logic that makes Enki's role so different in character from both the Greek and Enochic accounts. The me were always intended for human civilization. Their transmission was not a deviation from the divine plan, but its execution. As established in the Apkallu episode, the Apkallu are Enki's agents in later Mesopotamian tradition. Emissaries whose purpose was specifically civilizational uplift. The Apkallu are not Enki himself, and the distinction is theologically significant. Enki does not descend. He sends. The transmission is managed, structured, and sanctioned from the beginning. The most sustained Mesopotamian reflection on Enki's relationship to human knowledge comes through the Adapa myth, preserved in Akkadian texts from the 2nd millennium BC. Adapa, the first Apkallu, is Enki's chosen representative and, in some versions, his own son. The myth presents Enki granting Adapa exceptional wisdom. Adapa is given understanding. He is given mastery of words. He is given the capacity to serve as the model of human knowledge. When Adapa is later summoned before On a charge of breaking the wing of the south wind, and offered the food and water of immortality, Enki intervenes and instructs Adapa to refuse it. The precise motivation for Enki's instruction has generated scholarly debate. The Adapa myth is the Mesopotamian tradition's most nuanced engagement with the limits of the divine gift of knowledge and what happens at the threshold where human wisdom approaches the boundary of divine immortality. What the myth does not do in any of its versions is condemn Enki for granting Adapa wisdom in the first place. The wisdom was his to give. The giving was appropriate. Enki's consistent orientation toward humanity is nowhere more apparent than in the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest flood narratives in the ancient record, predating the biblical account by more than a millennium. When Enlil resolves to destroy humanity with the flood, driven by his account of their noise and their disruption of divine rest, it is Enki who finds the means to preserve them. Enki warns the flood hero Atrahasis, instructs him in the construction of the vessel, and navigates around the divine decree that forbade directly telling a human what the gods had decided. The move is characteristic. Enki works within and around the divine order to protect humanity from its more punitive moments. He is not a rebel. He is an advocate. What emerges across the Sumerian and Akkadian records, the Adapa myth, the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, the texts recording the Apkallu's civilizational teachings, is a coherent theology of knowledge transfer. Enki gives, humanity receives. The divine order endorses it. There is no transgression because there is no prohibition on the giving. The me were always intended to be shared. The Apkallu's arrival before the flood was the mechanism by which the divine management of civilization was expressed, not violated. The boundary between gods and humans in the Mesopotamian theological imagination is not a wall, but a permeable membrane that Enki actively manages. And humanity's acquisition of civilizational knowledge is the expected outcome of that management. This has a direct implication for the Mesopotamian tradition's verdict. Enki is not punished because there is nothing to punish. Humanity is not condemned for receiving what was given. The knowledge itself is not presented as dangerous, corrupting, or inappropriate for human possession. The Sumerian and Akkadian records celebrate the Apkallu as the founders of civilization, the post-flood Apkallu. The sages who carry the tradition into the historical period are honored figures. The knowledge transfer is the origin story of everything good. It is the tradition's founding gift. Enki's near-total absence from Western discourse about the knowledge-giver archetype is not a suppression. It is a loss. The Mesopotamian tradition was buried with the fall of cuneiform literacy. A gradual process across the last centuries, BC, and the early centuries of the Common Era, as cuneiform script ceased to be transmitted and the clay tablets sank into the tells of Mesopotamian cities for 2,500 years. The Greek and Hebrew traditions, which shaped Western intellectual inheritance through continuous textual transmission, had no direct access to Enki's theological role as the benevolent knowledge giver. What survived into Western consciousness from the Mesopotamian tradition arrived in fragments, mediated through Berossus, and later through the interpretive lens of cultures that had already established their own answers to the question Enki addresses. Recovering Enki does not resolve the theological disagreement, but it makes the disagreement visible. And it reveals that the two traditions, Western civilization, primarily inherited, Greek and Enochic, were not the only options available. The next episode we have not yet covered in this series, the Divine Council in the Hebrew Bible, will trace how the broader Mesopotamian divine assembly structure was inherited and transformed in Israelite theology. That transformation is part of the same story this episode is examining. But Enki's benevolence makes the Greek tradition's answer sharper by contrast. The Mesopotamian tradition gave its knowledge giver a clear conscience and an honored legacy. One of the cleanest and most benevolent versions of the archetype preserved from the ancient Near East. What the Greek tradition inherited was the same structural situation, a figure who transfers knowledge to humanity. But it embedded that transfer in a framework of theft, divine prohibition, and severe punishment. The knowledge was not given. It was taken, and the divine order did not endorse it. It responded with chains, an eagle, and eternity. Prometheus, in Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, an act for which Zeus punished him with perpetual torture. By the end of this chapter, you will understand the precise content of the Prometheus myth in its primary sources, what the punishment consisted of, why the Greek tradition celebrated Prometheus despite the transgression, and what the eventual release encodes about the tradition's theology of transgression and vindication. The Hesiodic Prometheus is not a god, but a titan, one of the older divine order that preceded the Olympians. And his relationship to humanity is already oppositional to Zeus from the beginning of the Theogony's account. Prometheus deceives Zeus twice on humanity's behalf. The first deception occurs at Mekone, when the gods and humanity were dividing the sacrificial ox. Prometheus arranged the portions, so humanity received the edible meat, while the gods received bones covered with fat. Zeus was not deceived about the trick. Hesiod is explicit that Zeus saw through it. But the cosmic precedent was set. The arrangement at Mekone established that humans would retain the nourishing portions of sacrifice, while the gods received the appearance of honor. The second deception, the theft of fire, is the direct response to Zeus's retaliatory withdrawal of fire from humanity. When Zeus withheld fire after Mecone, Prometheus stole it from the gods. Hidden in a hollow fennel stalk, carried to humanity, against Zeus's explicit decision. What Prometheus transferred was fire specifically, not knowledge in the generic sense, not writing, law, or philosophy, but fire, which in Hesiod carries the full weight of the technological capacity that distinguishes human civilization from animal existence. Fire enables cooking, metalworking, warmth, and the manufacture of every tool, weapon, shelter, and material product that makes human culture possible. In Hesiod's formulation, fire is the enabling condition of human civilization. The theft of fire is therefore the theft of the civilizational capacity itself. Zeus's punishment was proportionate to the scope of the transgression, or rather designed to be infinite in duration, as if the transgression were infinite in kind. Prometheus was chained to a rock in the Caucasus. An eagle came each day to eat his liver. His liver regenerated each night. The process began again at dawn. The punishment was designed to be perpetual, to fill time as Prometheus had filled human history. With no end that Zeus initially intended to permit, Pandora, the first woman, fashioned by Hephaestus and given evils sealed in a jar, was sent as the punishment distributed to humanity for receiving the stolen fire. The Hesiodic tradition does not celebrate the gift without acknowledging its cost. Humanity paid for what Prometheus gave with all the suffering Pandora's jar released into the world. But the tradition does not condemn Prometheus for the giving. The cost falls on humanity. The hero is still a hero. It is in Aeschylus that the hero tradition reaches its fullest development. In Prometheus Bound, the surviving play of what was likely a trilogy, Prometheus is explicitly portrayed with a sympathy that Zeus is denied. Aeschylus's Prometheus claims to have given humanity not only fire, but the full range of the civilizational arts, agriculture, mathematics, writing, navigation, medicine, and the interpretation of dreams and omens. In Aeschylus, the claim is total, that human civilization in all its forms derives from Prometheus's gift. Whether Aeschylus was expanding on or departing from the Hesiodic account is a question Hesiodic scholars have debated. What matters for this argument is that the Greek tradition developed from a precise Hesiodic account of stolen fire into a broad cultural claim of total civilizational debt to a single transgressive figure, the eventual release of Prometheus, drawn on, in later traditions, from the lost Aeschylean plays and other mythographic sources, is the element that most sharply distinguishes the Greek tradition from the Enochic one. It is worth noting that this release is not the center of Hesiod's account in the way the theft and punishment are. The Theogony's Prometheus narrative builds toward the punishment established, not its resolution. The release belongs to the broader, later tradition, especially as developed through Aeschylus and the mythographic inheritance that followed. In that tradition, Heracles kills the eagle. Zeus permits the release. The chains are broken. Prometheus walks out of the Caucasus and into the tradition's memory as a vindicated hero whose punishment, though terrible and prolonged, was ultimately finite. The transgression was real. The punishment was real. But the tradition that preserved the story made the verdict clear. The giver of fire was, in the end, justified. Note this: Prometheus is eventually freed. The punishment ends. The tradition holds that outcome. The transgression of the divine human boundary, however punishable, was not a permanent cosmic crime. The Greek tradition has an answer to what happens to its knowledge giver at the end of history. And the answer is release. The contrast with what happens to Azazel has not yet been addressed. The same punishment structure, binding, confinement, waiting, produces two completely different outcomes. We will come back to this. The Greek tradition gave its knowledge giver a punishment commensurate with the transgression, a tradition that celebrated him despite it, and an eventual release that acknowledged his vindication. The archetype of the heroic transgressor, whose gift to humanity justifies the suffering it cost. However, the Enochic tradition inherited the same archetype, a divine being who transfers forbidden knowledge to humanity and is punished for it, and arrived at a completely different verdict on every element. What Prometheus gave was fire. What Azazel gave was weapons, ornamentation, and the technologies of violence and seduction. The wider Watcher tradition extended the corruption into enchantments and astral knowledge. What Prometheus suffered was terrible but finite. What Azazel suffers ends in fire, not release. And the tradition that preserved Azazel's story did not celebrate him. It held him responsible for everything. Azazel in 1 Enoch 8-10 taught humanity weapons, metalwork, and ornamentation, while the surrounding Watcher catalog extends into enchantments, root cuttings, and astral knowledge. And the divine verdict in 1 Enoch 10:8 is that all sin is ascribed to him. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly what Azazel transferred, why the Enochic tradition's verdict is the opposite of the Greek tradition's, and what the punishment structure encodes about each tradition's theology of knowledge. For viewers arriving from the Greek mythology side, Azazel is one of the 200 Watchers, divine beings who in the Enochic tradition descended on Mount Hermon, formed an illicit covenant, and crossed the boundary between heaven and earth. The tradition is preserved in 1 Enoch, a Jewish text of the Second Temple period. Roughly the third to 1st centuries BC, that was excluded from the Hebrew Bible and most Christian canons, but preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The 5 Satans and the scapegoat ritual episode of this series established Azazel's crimes and punishment in the ritual context. This chapter addresses the knowledge transfer dimension specifically for viewers new to the Enochic material. What Azazel transferred is recorded in specific detail in 1 Enoch 8:1-2. The passage names his specific transmissions. He taught men to make swords, shields, and breastplates. He taught women the arts of ornamentation. The use of antimony, precious stones, and dye for the eyes. These are Azazel's attributed crimes in the text. The surrounding Watcher catalogue in 1 Enoch 8 distributes further forbidden knowledge, among other figures. Enchantments, root cuttings, and astral knowledge assigned to Watchers, including Semyaza, Armaros, Barakiel, and Kokabiel. But the tradition's verdict singles out Azazel above all of them. The full catalogue is a collective crime. The total guilt flows to one name. The divine verdict descends swiftly. In 1 Enoch 10:8, the judgment is delivered with a totality found nowhere else in the ancient record. To Azazel, ascribe all sin, not a portion of sin, not responsibility for the specific acts listed. All sin. The knowledge transfer is not treated as one crime among many, but as the root crime, the originating act from which human corruption in its entirety derives. This is the strongest possible negative verdict on a knowledge transfer available in any ancient tradition. Enki gave knowledge. Humanity was elevated. Enki was honored. Prometheus gave knowledge. Humanity was elevated. Prometheus was chained. Azazel gave knowledge. Humanity was corrupted. Azazel was buried. Same act, 3 traditions. 3 verdicts on the act. 2 verdicts on what the knowledge did to humanity. 1 verdict on whether the punishment ends. The archetype is identical, the theology is not. Return now to the full account. Raphael is sent, not as an executioner, but as the agent of binding. He is instructed to bind Azazel hand and foot, to cast him into the darkness of the desert of Dudael, to cover him with rough, jagged rocks, to cover his face so he cannot see the light, and to leave him there until the day of judgment, at which point fire is the appointed end. The punishment does not diminish over time. It is not calibrated toward release. At the eschatological horizon, fire replaces the rocks, not liberation, but destruction. The Enochic tradition does not free its knowledge giver. It buries him and ultimately burns him. The difference in the content of what was transferred matters to the verdict. And the Enochic tradition is precise about this. Prometheus gave fire, a single foundational enabling capacity. The tools humanity makes with fire are humanity's own achievement. The fire is the condition, not the instrument. Azazel gave the direct instruments of warfare and vanity: the sword, the shield, the breastplate, the cosmetics, the ornamentation. The surrounding Watcher catalogue extends further into enchantments and astral knowledge. But Azazel's specific contribution is weapons and the arts of feminine adornment. The Enochic tradition chose to locate the origin of human violence and the seduction of vanity in a specific divine transgression, and it named that transgressor precisely. The content of Azazel's transfer is not incidental to the condemnation. It is the condemnation. The moral inversion is complete. Where Prometheus's punishment is presented by his own tradition as unjust and eventually remedied, Azazel's punishment is presented as the correct and proportionate response to a genuine cosmic crime. The Enochic tradition is not recording a tragedy. It is recording a verdict. Azazel is not a hero, he is the source. What these 3 chapters have assembled is not a comparative mythology survey. It is the evidence base for a single specific argument. 3 ancient traditions Each possessed the same archetype. Each used it to answer the same question about the origin of human knowledge, and each arrived at a completely different verdict on the act and the actor. The second half of this video asks what those three verdicts reveal, about the traditions that held them, about the specific theological arguments they were making against each other, and about the question all three were trying to answer without any of them fully succeeding. 3 figures, 3 transfers, 3 punishments, 3 verdicts. And the structural parallel is close enough to demand a historical explanation, which means the 3 traditions were not independently inventing the same archetype, but inheriting and responding to it. The question of how the 3 traditions relate to each other, whether they borrowed directly, whether they drew on a shared reservoir, or whether the Enochic tradition was making a specific argument against one of the others, has a specific answer. And that answer tells us something about what the Enochic tradition believed it was doing when it took the most celebrated knowledge giver in the ancient Near Eastern world and declared him the source of all sin. The 3 traditions share a structural parallel that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence, especially in the Enochic relationship to Mesopotamian antediluvian wisdom traditions. But the question of how directly they relate to each other has a specific answer that the evidence can support. By the end of this chapter, you will understand where influence is strongest, where it remains plausible, and why the Enochic inversion was a deliberate theological act rather than an independent development. Before presenting that argument, consider the most comfortable version of the evidence. The knowledge giver archetype is structurally available to any culture that reflects on the origin of technology and civilization. The pattern of divine gift, boundary transgression, and punishment is not uniquely Near Eastern. Structurally similar narratives appear in cultures with no plausible contact with the Mesopotamian or Greek traditions. Joseph Campbell would categorize this as a universal archetypal pattern, the deep human psychological tendency to explain the origin of technology through a mediating figure who stands between the divine and human worlds. Every culture needs an account of how humans acquired skills that seem too complex to have been invented from nothing. The divine gift narrative is one of the most structurally available explanations. The independent development hypothesis is held by serious scholars and is not dismissible on its face. Here is why it fails for these 3 specific traditions. The connection between the Enochic tradition and the Mesopotamian Apkallu framework is not a parallel, but a response. As established in the Apkallu episode of this series, the scholar Amar Anas has demonstrated that the specificity of the structural parallel between the Watchers and the Apkallu, in number, in their pre-flood sequence, in the flood connection itself, in the post-flood diminishment from divine to semi-divine to human sages, goes beyond what independent development can account for. The Enochic tradition was produced by Jewish communities with direct exposure to Babylonian cultural space, whether during the Babylonian exile or in the sustained cultural contact of the subsequent Persian and Hellenistic periods. They knew the Apkallu tradition, the inversion of the Apkallu's moral verdict. from civilizational benefactors to condemned transgressors, was a deliberate theological argument, not an independent development of the same pattern. The direction of that argument matters. The Babylonian tradition celebrated its knowledge givers. The Apkallu were the foundation of civilization. Their teaching before the flood was the origin of every art and practice that made Babylonian culture possible. For Jewish communities, living within or adjacent to the Babylonian cultural world, communities that had experienced Babylonian power as conquest and exile, that had watched the temple destroyed and their institutions replaced by Babylonian ones. The Babylonian founding narrative was not a neutral cultural inheritance. What Babylon called its greatest gift, the gift of civilization through divine sages, the Enochic tradition called a crime. What Babylon built its entire cultural identity upon, the arts of writing, calculation, metalworking, military technology, the Enochic tradition attributed to transgression. The inversion is specific, targeted, and culturally motivated. It is a theological argument about whose account of the origin of civilization is correct. Babylon called it a gift. Jerusalem called it a crime. Both were talking about the same beings. The Greek tradition's relationship to the Near Eastern material is a different and more complex question. M.L. West, in the East Face of Helicon. The most sustained scholarly treatment of West Asiatic elements in Greek poetry and myth traces the points of contact between the Prometheus tradition and earlier Near Eastern material, particularly through the ancient cultural exchange networks of the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. The motif of the divine being punished for benefiting humanity appears in Mesopotamian texts that predate the earliest Greek sources. The direction of influence where it can be traced runs from east to west. The Greek Prometheus tradition did not develop in direct response to the Enochic tradition. The chronology makes direct borrowing unlikely in either direction. But both traditions were responding to the same underlying Mesopotamian original from different cultural positions and with different conclusions. The Greek tradition inherited the Near Eastern knowledge giver and celebrated him. The Enochic tradition inherited the same figure and condemned him. Neither was inventing from scratch. The three-way picture that emerges is this. The Mesopotamian material is the oldest and most important background. The Enochic tradition engages it much more directly than the Greek tradition does. The Watchers/Apkallu relationship is the strongest link in the argument. The Greek tradition may preserve related Near Eastern motifs through the cultural exchange networks, West documents, but direct borrowing is harder to establish than in the Enochic case. The Greek tradition's relationship to the Mesopotamian knowledge giver is plausible and scholarly supported, but carries more uncertainty than the Enochic inversion. Neither the Greek nor the Enochic tradition was inventing from scratch, but the lines of influence differ in their strength and directness. There is one further dimension, the archetype's emotional power. The identification with the giver, the sense that humanity was owed what it received, the anger at the divine order for withholding or punishing, is present across all three traditions, even when the verdict differs. In the Greek tradition, that emotional identification is fully expressed. Prometheus bound is structured to generate sympathy for the transgressor and critical distance from Zeus. In the Enochic tradition, that emotional identification is systematically suppressed. Azazel generates no sympathy in 1st Enoch. The binding is not presented as unjust. The divine verdict is not questioned. The suppression of sympathy is itself a theological act. The Enochic tradition was not merely condemning Azazel, but actively dismantling the emotional architecture that made the Babylonian narrative of divine beneficence so compelling. The three traditions are in conversation with each other, responding to a shared Mesopotamian original from three different cultural positions, arriving at three different verdicts, encoding in those verdicts their most fundamental disagreements about the nature of knowledge, the relationship between divine and human spheres, and the proper limits of what humanity is allowed to possess. But the deepest difference between the three traditions is not in the act, not in the punishment, and not even in the verdict on what the knowledge did to humanity. It is in whether the punishment ends. And that difference Prometheus released, Azazel condemned to fire, encodes something about what each tradition believed evil ultimately is, something that can be redeemed or something that cannot. Prometheus is eventually freed by Heracles. Azazel waits for fire at the final judgment and is never released. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what this difference in outcome encodes about each tradition's theology of evil, transgression, and whether the boundary violations of the divine-human crossing are ultimately correctable. This is the difference named at the opening. Prometheus freed, Azazel not. We are here. The register has to drop again. What the outcome divergence carries is too fundamental for the scholarly voice alone. Prometheus is freed. Heracles breaks the chains. The eagle is killed. The punishment ends. Zeus permits it. The transgression happened. The punishment was real. And then it was over. Azazel is never freed. The rocks stay. The darkness stays. At the end of history, fire comes. Not release, destruction. Same act, different ending. The difference is everything. What Prometheus's release encodes is a specific theology of transgression. The Greek tradition ultimately held that the crossing of the divine-human boundary, however punishable, however catastrophic in its immediate consequences, was not an absolute cosmic crime. The universe is the kind of place where transgression can be absorbed. The divine order can be affronted, can respond with terrible punishment, and can eventually accommodate the transgressor's vindication without the cosmic architecture collapsing. Evil, or at least the specific kind of evil that Prometheus represents, is correctable. The punishment was proportionate, finite, and ultimately capable of being satisfied. The giver's act was real, the suffering was real, and the release was real. All three together constitute the Greek tradition's full answer to what the knowledge giver was. What Azazel's permanent condemnation encodes is the opposite theology. The Enochic tradition held that the transgression of the divine human boundary was not merely punishable, but cosmically irremediable. The corruption Azazel introduced into human history is not something that can be absorbed over time and resolved by release. It is something that can only be contained until the final judgment renders it extinct. Evil, in the Enochic framework, is not correctable. It is permanently damaging until the eschatological fire removes it entirely. The punishment does not end because the crime does not stop having consequences. Azazel remains bound, not because Zeus has not yet relented, but because the damage he caused is still active in human history. The rocks over his face are not a temporary measure. They are the ongoing containment of an ongoing catastrophe. The Enki comparison sharpens both positions. Enki's knowledge transfers require no punishment and no correction because they were sanctioned. The divine human boundary in the Mesopotamian theology was not a wall, but a permeable membrane that the divine order actively managed. Corruption did not enter with the knowledge Enki gave, because the knowledge was given, not taken, and not transgressed. The divine order was not affronted by Enki's transfers. It authorized them. The Mesopotamian theological framework simply does not contain the premise of permanent damage because it does not contain the premise of absolute transgression in the first place. Enki's benevolent management of the divine human boundary is the theological condition under which the question of whether the punishment ends does not arise. What the three outcomes together reveal is three different theologies of the divine human boundary and of what happens when it is crossed. Mesopotamian. The boundary is managed by the gods, and crossing it is acceptable when sanctioned. The question of punishment does not arise where there is no transgression. Greek. The boundary is real. The crossing is a genuine transgression. The punishment is terrible and prolonged. But the universe is ultimately capable of absorbing the transgression and releasing the transgressor. Evil is correctable. Enochic. The boundary is absolute. The crossing is catastrophic. The damage is permanent. The punishment cannot end because the transgression cannot be undone. Evil requires not correction, but eschatological destruction. These are not three versions of the same theology. They are three fundamentally different accounts of what the world is. The legacy in Western civilization follows from this divergence directly. The Greek answer, transgression is possible, punishment is finite, vindication is achievable, became the dominant framework in Western cultural imagination for the relationship between human ambition and divine or institutional authority. Prometheus is the archetype of the scientist, the artist, and the revolutionary, the figure who transgresses the limits of what is sanctioned, suffers terribly for it, and is eventually vindicated by history. Every story Western culture tells about the genius punished in life and celebrated in death, the discovery condemned by the institution and vindicated by the evidence, the revolution imprisoned before it prevails. These are Promethean stories in structure, whether or not their tellers know Prometheus. The Greek tradition gave its knowledge givers act a permanent moral weight in Western cultural memory. The Enochic answer, the boundary was absolute. The crossing was catastrophic. The damage is permanent. Shaped Western Christian theology through the fallen angel tradition. But as this series has traced across multiple episodes, the specific knowledge giver framing was progressively lost as Azazel was absorbed into the singular devil. The theological consequence of the crossing survived. The specific content of what was crossed, the transfer of named forbidden knowledge, did not. The difference between Prometheus's release and Azazel's permanent condemnation encodes the deepest theological disagreement between the traditions. Not about what was transferred, but about whether the universe is the kind of place where that transgression can ultimately be corrected. Which raises the final question the three traditions together force into view. If Western civilization inherited primarily the Greek answer through its educational and artistic canon, what did it lose when it also inherited the Enochic answer through the fallen angel tradition, but stripped that answer of its specific knowledge-giver framing? What happened when Azazel was absorbed into the singular devil, and his specific crime against knowledge was forgotten? When Azazel was absorbed into the singular devil, through the patristic synthesis this series has traced, his specific identity as a knowledge-giver, the being whose crime was the transfer of specific, named forbidden knowledge, was lost. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what that loss means for how Western civilization thinks about knowledge, ambition, and the proper limits of human capacity. The patristic synthesis collapsed Azazel, Samyaza, Gadriel, Lucifer, and the Job Satan into a single devil, whose defining characteristic is cosmic rebellion against God. This synthesis, traced across the earlier episodes of this series, was not a deliberate suppression of the knowledge-giver tradition, but a theological consolidation that had its own logic. The singular devil provided a coherent account of the adversarial force in creation without the theological complexity of multiple distinct fallen figures, each with specific crimes and specific roles. Consolidation was theologically cleaner. But the consolidation had a cost. What the absorption erased was the specific content of Azazel's crime. The devil rebels, tempts, and opposes. He does not teach metalworking. He does not teach women the arts of ornamentation with antimony and precious stones. He does not teach the cutting of roots or the reading of the stars. The singular devil of Western Christian theology retained the emotional structure of the Enochic verdict, the sense that something transgressed the divine human boundary and corrupted humanity, that the punishment will be permanent. But the specific knowledge-giver framing did not survive the synthesis. The connection between Azazel's named forbidden knowledge and the adversarial force in creation was severed. What the Greek tradition kept, and what the Enochic tradition lost in translation, is the specific identification of the knowledge-giver as the carrier of the transgression. You cannot be a Promethean without knowing what Prometheus did. The act of transgression, the specific theft of fire, is constitutive of the identity. You can be afraid of the devil without knowing what Azazel taught. The specific content of his crime has been forgotten, while the emotional force of his condemnation has not. The Greek tradition preserved its transgressor's identity precisely because it preserved his specific act. The Enochic tradition's legacy in Western Christianity preserved the condemnation while losing the act that generated it. The consequence for how Western civilization thinks about knowledge is structural. the Promethean archetype, the scientist who transgresses the limits of what should be known, the revolutionary who suffers for the gift, the figure who is eventually vindicated by the tradition that condemned him, is deeply embedded in Western intellectual culture. It is the narrative frame through which Western civilization typically understands the relationship between human ambition and institutional authority. Every story of the heretic vindicated by history, the discovery punished in its time and celebrated later, the artist whose transgression becomes canonical. These are Promethean stories. The Greek tradition did not merely give Western civilization a myth, it gave it a narrative grammar for how transgression and vindication relate to each other. The Azazelian archetype, the idea that specific knowledge is the source of corruption, that the arts of warfare and ornamentation, and the wider Watcher catalog of forbidden arts are precisely what destroyed humanity's original condition, is present in persistent religious and cultural anxiety about certain technologies. But it has lost its specific character. The anxiety survives. The named knowledge giver, who is its origin, does not. When a culture worries that certain technologies carry their own corruption, that the weapons we build inevitably find their uses, that the arts of surveillance or manipulation or destruction are not neutral tools. That anxiety has an Azazelian structure, but it has lost the specific figure who names it. The theological precision that the Enochic tradition brought to the question, this knowledge transferred by this being for these reasons, has been replaced by a diffuse unease without a face. Enki's complete absence is the final dimension of this loss, the most benevolent version of the archetype. The one in which knowledge transfer was a divine gift freely given, where the divine human boundary was managed rather than violated, where humanity was elevated without corruption, is present in Western civilization only as an archaeological discovery, not as a living tradition. The recovery of Enki from the Mesopotamian record does not resolve the theological disagreement between the Greek and Enochic answers, but it completes the picture of what the conversation was. And it raises the possibility that the question the three traditions were all trying to answer has a third answer neither of the two surviving traditions has fully explored. Samael, the knowledge-adjacent adversarial figure in Jewish tradition, represents another strand of this inheritance this series has not yet traced. Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, closely associated with the Apkallu and their civilizational teachings to humanity before the flood, the knowledge transfer celebrated as civilization's founding gift. The divine order's response, not punishment, but endorsement. Humanity elevated. The boundary between gods and humans made porous by design. Never punished, never condemned, and in the Western tradition, almost entirely forgotten. Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Punished by Zeus with eternal torture on a rock in the Caucasus, eventually freed by Heracles. The gift celebrated in the tradition that preserved it, the punishment real, but ultimately finite. The transgression acknowledged, but the transgressor ultimately vindicated. The archetype that Western civilization absorbed most completely. Azazel, the watcher who taught humanity weapons, forbidden arts, and the knowledge of corruption, condemned by the divine verdict of 1 Enoch 10:8 as the source of all sin, bound beneath the desert of Dudael, never freed, awaiting fire at the final judgment. The gift, reframed as the crime, humanity not elevated but damaged. His specific identity absorbed into the singular devil, and his specific crime forgotten. The archetype, recognizable across all three. Descent from the divine, knowledge transfer to humanity, divine response, permanent change to the human condition. The structure remains recognizable. The verdict changes completely. The outcome divergence, Prometheus freed, Azazel not. The difference in coding what each tradition believed about whether the transgression of the divine human boundary was ultimately correctable or permanently catastrophic. The deepest theological disagreement between them expressed not in the act, but in its ending. The question that survives all three. Whether the knowledge that defines human civilization is something we were given, something we took, or something that was always ours and only needed a messenger. None of the three traditions resolves this. All three preserve it in the figure they built to carry it. The Sumerian answer to the question of human knowledge is the most comfortable. We were given it by beings who wanted us to have it, by a God whose specific project was human flourishing. The gift was clean. The giver was honored. The boundary between divine and human was not violated. It was bridged deliberately by the God who managed it. The Greek answer is more ambiguous. The gift was real, the elevation was real, but the act required transgression. The divine order did not sanction it. The giver suffered for it. The punishment was terrible and prolonged. But the tradition that preserved the story made the giver a hero, not a criminal, and eventually freed him. The transgression was acknowledged but not final. The Enochic answer is the darkest. The gift was a crime. What humanity received was not elevation but corruption. The instruments, the metalworking, the weapons, the ornamentation, and the wider Watcher catalog of forbidden arts were precisely the instruments of humanity's fall. The giver is not a hero. He is the source of all sin. He will never be freed. The fire that ends his imprisonment is not liberation. It is judgment. Three traditions, three answers. The one that shaped Western civilization most deeply is the middle one. The Greek answer. Mediated through Rome, mediated through the Renaissance, mediated through every story of the brilliant transgressor who suffers for his gift and is eventually vindicated. Prometheus is the archetype of the scientist, the artist, the revolutionary. Azazel is the archetype of the demon. Enki is almost forgotten. What would it mean to take all three seriously simultaneously? The question is not which tradition was correct. It is what we lose by only inheriting one. And it is what we might recover if we read all three as three answers to the same question. Answers that were never fully resolved in their own time and have not been resolved since.